Section 21 of Hobbes by Leslie Stephen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, The State, Part 4. In fact, Hobbes's Leviathan represents what is called the modern state. Supremacy of the law, absolute authority of the governing power, and unity of the administrative system may be most fully realized when the sovereign is not an individual but an organic body. Government represents or bears the person of the people, not in Hobbes's sense that whatsoever the sovereign wills becomes their will, but in the inverse sense that whatever they will becomes his will. Similar consequences follow in either version. Hobbes, for example, believes in the equality of man. It is one of his laws of nature that every man acknowledge another for his equal by nature. Even if men were not equal, they would only make the compact on conditions of equality. Inequality of subjects, he says elsewhere, is made by the sovereign, and therefore all must be equal before the sovereign, as kings and subjects are equal before the King of Kings. Crimes of great men are not extenuated but aggravated by the greatness of their persons. If they are favored, impunity maketh insolence, insolence hatred, and hatred an endeavor to pull down all oppressing and contumelious greatness, though with the ruin of the commonwealth. No subject can acquire any rights which will impede the full exercise of the sovereign power. The property of subjects in lands, for example, consisteth in right to exclude all other subjects from the use of them, and not to exclude their sovereign, be it an assembly or a monarch. If land is not to be nationalized, the landowner's right is never absolute. So in all systems, subject, that is, in all associations of any kind, no power can be enjoyed except what the sovereign chooses to allow. They must be thoroughly subordinate to his will, though in practice they have an awkward tendency to independence. Among the diseases of a commonwealth, Hobbes reckons great towns able to furnish an army — London, of course, is in his mind — as well as the great number of corporations which are, as it were, many lesser commonwealths in the bowels of the greater, like worms in the entrails of a natural man. The principle is evidently fatal to privileged estates or corporations. The king or sovereign may call in councillors, but they must remain councillors only. That, for example, is the case with the House of Commons. But the House of Lords has no better claim. Good counsel comes not by inheritance. The claim of certain persons to have a place in the highest council by inheritance is derived from the conquests of the ancient Germans. Their chiefs were able to extract privileges for their posterity. Such privileges, however, are inconsistent with sovereign power, and if men contend for them as a right, they must needs by degrees let them go, and be content with the honour due to their natural abilities. This consequence of the supremacy of the sovereign illustrates one curious contrast between Hobbes and his opponents. The parliamentary party had to defend privilege against prerogative, and privilege has to be defended by precedent. The party, therefore, which would in modern phrase claim to be the party of progress, justified itself by appealing to antiquity. When indeed you cut off a king's head, you have to appeal to general principles. Constitutional precedents are not available. Milton had to claim indefeasible rights for the people, and men like honest John Lilburne used language which anticipated Paine's Rights of Man. But in the earlier stages of the quarrel, Coke's gigantic knowledge of old records and superstitious reverence for the common law, that is, for tradition and custom, was a stronghold of the party. Hobbes rejects the whole doctrine. An absolute political theory could not fit into the constitutional tradition or justify the heterogeneous products of historical accidents. His treatise on the common law expresses his aversion to Coke. He had already quoted him in the Leviathan to show how men's judgments were perverted by trusting to precedent. If the man who first judged unjustly, no injustice can be a pattern of justice to succeeding judges. No custom again can justify itself. If use obtaineth the authority of a law, it is not the length of time that maketh the authority, but the will of the sovereign signified by his silence. The tacit consent of a ruler may make a custom law, but many unjust actions and unjust sentences go uncontrolled for a longer time than any man can remember. Only reasonable customs should be law, and evil customs should be abolished. The sovereign must decide what is reasonable and what should be abolished. According to Hobbes, then, all political machinery is absolutely subordinate to the sovereign. His power is the sole working force, and every resisting element must be ejected or brought under control. The law is the expression of his will, and though he may enforce rules which have grown up independently, they can only exist on sufferance or by his tacit consent. In that respect, Hobbes was at one with the most thoroughgoing revolutionists who ever proposed to rearrange the political order upon an ideal plan, and to abolish all traditional law which is not in conformity with the dictates of reason. As a matter of fact, Hobbes's legal doctrine came to life again in the hands of Bentham and his follower Austin, the legal lights of the philosophical radicals. Maine observes that they had scarcely anything to add to Hobbes's analysis of the meaning of law. Hobbes puts his theory with all possible clearness in the De Cive and the Leviathan. A law is a command of that person whose precept contains in it the reason of obedience. The civil law is the command of the sovereign. We are bound to obey it because it is his command, as soon as we know it to be his. It must therefore be promulgated in order that we may know it, and have a penalty annexed to it in order that we may obey it. For vain is that law which may be broken without punishment. When we are solemnly informed that a law is a command of the sovereign, enforced by a sanction, the impulse of the unregenerate mind is to reply, "That is what I always supposed." Parliament and the policeman are phenomena too obvious to be overlooked. The great manufactory which is always turning out laws, and the rod which will smite us if we do not obey, are always with us. What else should a law be than a rule made by one and enforced by the other? We are told in reply that great confusion has arisen by confounding such laws with laws of nature, laws which are supposed to exist in some transcendental world, and yet to supply the necessary basis for the laws of actual life, and which have to be applied to life by the help of such shifty and ambiguous hypotheses as the social contract. I do not doubt that this is true, but it suggests one question. Austin and his disciples were always exposing the absurdity of the law of nature and the social contract, and yet their own doctrine coincides with that of Hobbes, who professes to make these theories an integral part of his system. The explanation is simple and gives the essence of Hobbes. According to Hobbes, in fact, the law of nature has a singularly limited sphere of action. It only exists, one may say, in order to repeal itself. Before the social contract, he says, every man has a right to everything, which is practically equivalent to nobody having a right to anything. For if the same thing belongs to two men, neither has a right against the other. But the contract is itself made by every man resigning all his rights to the sovereign. When he has thus made them over, he can no longer make any claims under the law of nature. The sovereign may command him to do anything, except indeed to help to hang himself, and he is bound to obey. The law of nature orders him to obey the positive law, and does nothing else. This comes, however, of being thoroughly logical, after making one initial error. The law of nature is simply the law of self-preservation, and whatever necessarily follows from it. But in what sense of law can we call self-preservation a law? In one sense it is what Hobbes calls a theorem, not a law. It is, assuming its truth, a statement of fact. All men do aim at self-preservation. This is their one actual, and indeed their one possible principle. If so, it cannot be a law at all in the ethical or strictly legal sense. It expresses an essential condition of man's nature, and not a law imposed upon him from without. Men act for their own preservation, as stones fall by gravitation. It is a way they have, and they cannot have any other. Taking for granted the truth of the theorem, it will enable us to show how political institutions and civil laws have come into existence, but it does not show that they are right or wrong. It is as irrelevant to introduce the confusion as it would be to say that the angles of a triangle ought to be equal to two right angles. Hobbes's real theory comes out when we drop the imaginary contract altogether. We assume self-preservation as the universal instinct, and moreover, we must provisionally accept Hobbes's thoroughgoing egoism. Then, so long as there is no common superior, the instinct produces competition and war, and implies the nasty, brutish state of nature. How do men get out of it? Historically, he replies, governments may be made by conquest, or developed out of the family, which is a little monarchy. In both cases, sovereignty is acquired by force, and the subject submits from fear. Governments also are made by institution, that is, by the social contract, and in this case the motive is still fear, but fear of one another. Admitting then that even as an historical fact, sovereignty has been made by institution or contract, the essential motive is still the same. Each man sees that he will be better off, or preserve his life and means of living better, if he in his will obey a sovereign than if they remain masterless. The hypothesis that states were deliberately contrived and made by a bargain between separate atoms is, of course, absurd historically, but is also irrelevant to Hobbes. The essential point is simply that settled order is so much more favorable to self-preservation than anarchy, that everyone has a sufficient interest in maintaining it. Peace, as he tells us, means all the arts and sciences that distinguish Europeans from Choctaws. The original contractors can scarcely be supposed to have foreseen that, but at least it gives a very good reason for obedience. This comes out curiously in Hobbes's exceptions to the obligations of the contract. Men are not bound to kill themselves, because the tacit consideration for accepting the contract was the preservation of life and the means of life. He was logically bound to go further. If upon that ground they may repudiate the contract, they may break it whenever the end is frustrated, that is, whenever by keeping it they will be in a worse position. Moreover, since nobody ever acts except for his own good, they certainly will break it whether it is binding or not. In other words, the supposed contract is merely another version of the first principle of egoism. A man will always do what seems to be for his own interest. By calling it a contract, he gets the appearance of extending the obligation to a wider sphere, to cases, that is, in which a man's interest is opposed to his contract. But it is only an appearance. It is indeed true that when a sovereign has once been set up, fraud and force cease to pay, as a general rule, and honesty becomes the best policy. But that is more simply expressed without reference to a contract. It merely means that the most selfish of mankind finds that it is worth while to have a policeman round the corner. Indeed, the more selfish he is, the greater may be the convenience. By abandoning my supposed right to all things, I get an effectual right to most things, and that may be called a bargain. But it is a bargain which I shall only keep, and indeed can only keep, according to Hobbes, so long as the balance of profit is on my side. That is, it is not a bargain at all. The facts, however, remain, and Hobbes manages to state a clear and coherent scheme. His position may be compared to that of the old economists. They used to maintain that in taking for granted the selfishness of mankind, they were making a legitimate abstraction. Men, it is true, are not simply selfish. They have other motives than a love of money. But the love of money is so prominent an instinct in economic masses that we may consider it as the sole force at work. And so we may get a theory which will be approximately true, though requiring correction when applied to concrete cases. Hobbes virtually considers the political system insofar as it is based upon selfish motives and is worked by individual interests. No doubt such motives are tolerably prevalent. The obvious and most assignable motive for obeying the law is fear of the hangman, and all manner of selfish interests are furthered by maintaining a settled system of government. He thus obtains a clear conception of one important aspect of the political order. It means organized force. The state is held together by armies which protect us from invasion, and by the administrative system which preserves order at home. These are undeniable facts, which it is as well to recognize clearly, and which are most vigorously set forth in Hobbes's Leviathan. Certain limits to the value of his theory are equally plain. In the Leviathan, Hobbes says that the public ministers are parts organical of the commonwealth, and compares the judges to the organs of voice, the executive to the hands, ambassadors to eyes, and so forth. The analogy between the political and the individual organism is implied in the whole theory. But the Leviathan is an artificial body, and artificial means mechanical construction. The individual is the ultimate unit, and though he resigns his rights to the sovereign, it is always for his own personal advantage. The comparison to a body suggests the modern phrase, the social organism. But the artificial indicates that Hobbes does not really interpret the Leviathan as an organism. It is a big machine, or set of atoms held together by external bonds. Hobbes's egoism forces him to the doctrine that the particles gravitate together simply from fear of the magistrate or fear of your neighbor. Sympathy is ignored, and such sentiments as patriotism or public spirit or philanthropy are superficial modifications of selfishness, implying a readiness to adopt certain precautions for securing our own lives and properties. This involves a one-sided view of the conditions of social and political welfare. It may be fully admitted that organized force is essential to a civilized society, that it cannot exist or develop without its military and judicial bodies, its soldiers and its judges, its hangmen, jailers, and policemen, its whole protective apparatus. An animal cannot live without its teeth and claws. What is overlooked is the truth that other parts of the system are equally essential, and that there is a reciprocal dependence indicated by the word organic. Society is held together not simply by the legal sanctions, but by all the countless instincts and sympathies which bind men together, and by the spontaneous associations which have their sources outside of the political order. It may be granted to Hobbes that peace is an essential condition of progress, and that the sovereign must be created to keep the peace. It is equally true that the sovereign derives his power from other sources than mutual fear or dread of the legal sanctions. Society could not get on without the policeman, but the policeman could not keep order by the simple force of his truncheon. Force must be organized, but it cannot be organized out of simple egoism and fear. So when Hobbes defines law as the command of the sovereign, he is stating what in a fully developed state is an undeniable fact. The law is the system of rules promulgated and enforced by the sovereign power in spite of any conflicting customs. Historically speaking, laws are not the less the product of customs which have grown up spontaneously. They are the causes, not the effects, of the sovereign's authority, and in the last resort, the sovereign power must still rest upon custom. That is, upon all the complex motives from which arises loyalty to the state and upon which its vitality depends. Hobbes's position was indeed inevitable. The conception of sociology as a science, in which the political order is regarded as only part of the whole social system, had not yet arisen. That could not happen until historical methods of inquiry had begun to show their power, and the necessity of treating political questions in connection with the intellectual or the industrial evolution began to be perceived. The social contract theory helped Hobbes to pass over in summary fashion the great historical problems as to the way in which the state has actually been developed, and therefore the state itself could be regarded as held together by the purely political and legal forces. When he had deduced the sovereign power from the principle of self-preservation, he seemed to himself to have explained everything. He had got to the one force which held the units together, as gravitation holds together the solar system. The relation between subject and sovereign is the one bond from which all others may be deduced. The thoroughgoing acceptance of this assumption leads to some of the singular results by which he startled his contemporaries, though he announced them with superlative calmness as demonstrated truths. There are, as he has to admit, two sets of laws, which may occasionally conflict with the laws of the state. In the first place, there is the moral law. Hobbes was perfectly well aware that a king might be a fool or a brute. It seemed to follow that laws might be contrary to the dictates of morality. His opponents could point out to him that some of the Roman emperors had been far from model characters. Besides their other weaknesses, they had occasionally thought it right to give Christians to lions. Again, the Christian Church claimed obedience, and Hobbes was an orthodox Christian. What is the subject to do if his sovereign orders him to break the moral law or to deny the truth of religion? End of section 21. Section 22 of Hobbes by Leslie Stephen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, The State, Part 5. Number 4, the moral law. Hobbes does not shrink from the logical result of his principles. The moral law, he holds, is the law of nature. The law of nature, as we have seen, means essentially the law of self-preservation, and from that is deduced the virtue of justice, from which all other laws of nature are corollaries. Justice means keeping covenants, which becomes operative when a coercive power is constituted, that is, at the institution of the social contract. This contract, therefore, is at the base of all moral as well as of all political relations. It is presupposed in all particular contracts. Justice, the cardinal, or rather the sole virtue, means keeping covenants, but also keeping the primitive contract to which all others owe their binding force. It implies, therefore, unconditional obedience to the sovereign, who is the social contract incarnate. The sovereign cannot be unjust to a subject, for every subject is himself author of all that the sovereign does. Laws are the rules of just and unjust, nothing being reputed unjust that is not contrary to some law. The law of nature and the civil law contain each other and are of equal extent. Justice, gratitude, and other moral virtues are merely qualities that dispose men to peace and obedience, until the commonwealth is instituted. Then they become laws, for it is the sovereign power that obliges men to obey them. Thus the law of nature is part of the civil law, and reciprocally the civil law is part of the dictates of nature. Nobody, I believe, ever followed Hobbes in this audacious identification of law and morality. I must try to make some apology for a most estimable old gentleman, misled by an excessive passion for logic. In the first place, it may be held, whatever be the ultimate meaning of morality, the actual morality of a race is evolved in constant correlation with its social organization. Hobbes, who substituted the social contract for this process, and regarded sovereignty as the sole bond of union, could only approximate to this doctrine by making moral obligations a product of the sovereign will. It would be outrageous, no doubt, to suppose that a sovereign could make the moral law at his pleasure, so that lying might become a virtue, or gratitude a vice, if the lawgiver chose to alter the law. This is not Hobbes's meaning. Honesty, gratitude, and the like are, we see, useful qualities, and parts of the law of nature as tending to self-preservation. The sovereign, of course, cannot alter that fact. What he can do is make them obligatory, by establishing the state of security which makes their exercise possible or prudent for the individual. In the state of nature, the conduct would be self-destructive, which, when the commonwealth is formed, becomes self-preservative. But we may ask, will the power thus constituted aim at the end for which it was instituted? May not the sovereign do wrong? May he not be a brutal tyrant, or lay down laws which are immoral, because inconsistent with the welfare of the people? Is it in that case our duty to obey them? Must we submit to oppression or enslave our neighbors because the sovereign, whether king or parliament, commands it? Hobbes admits the possibility. They that have the sovereign power may commit iniquity, but not injustice or injury in the proper signification. That is, the sovereign's immorality gives no right to the subject to disobey or even to protest. The reason is that the only alternative is anarchy. Bad laws are better than no laws. Good, as we have seen, means what a man desires, and evil what he eschews. One counts that good which another counts evil, and the same man what now he esteemed for good, he immediately after looks on as evil, and the same thing which he calls good in himself he terms evil in another. There is no such thing as absolute good. Hence it is impossible to make a common rule from the tastes of particular men. We have to consider what is reasonable, but there are no other reasons in being but those of particular men and that of the city. It follows that the city is to determine what with reason is culpable. We are bound to obey the laws before we know what the laws are, for the state must precede the law. Therefore, no civil law whatever can be against the law of nature. The law of nature may forbid theft and adultery, but till we have civil laws, we do not know what theft and adultery are. When the Spartans permitted their youth to take other men's goods, the taking was not theft. In other words, all law becomes positive law, for the law of nature only orders us to obey the law of the sovereign. It has been said that whatsoever a man does against his conscience is sin. That is true in the state of nature, where a man has no rule but his own reason. It is not so with him that lives in a commonwealth, because the law is the public conscience by which he hath already undertaken to be guided. Otherwise, nobody would obey further than it seemed good in his own eyes. The subject, then, hands over the whole responsibility to the sovereign. Then it is in the laws of a commonwealth as it is in the laws of gaming. Whatsoever the gamesters all agree on is injustice to none of them. Are then the laws as arbitrary as the laws of a game? To that Hobbes has his answer. The safety of the people is the supreme law. The sovereign is obliged by the law of nature to procure this end, and to render an account thereof to God and to none but him. Remembering the peculiarity of Hobbes's theology, it may seem that this responsibility is perhaps illusory. It is more to his purpose that, as he puts it, the good of the sovereign and people cannot be separated. It is a weak sovereign that has weak subjects, and a weak people whose sovereign wanteth power to rule them at his will. It is clearly to the interest of the sovereign, as it is also his duty, to maintain order. But to maintain order is, according to Hobbes, to enforce morality. The sovereign has to instruct his people in the fundamental rights of his office. To do so is not only his duty, but his benefit also, and security against the danger that may arise to himself in his natural person from rebellion. He proceeds in his quaint fashion to point out that this duty of instructing the people is the duty of impressing upon them the 10 Commandments. Since kings are mortal gods, the commandments of the first table are applicable to them as well as to the Supreme Being. Clearly, a man who proves that kings not only should but naturally will adopt the 10 Commandments is preaching a sound morality. It is necessary, however, to remember Hobbes's general ethical conception. Every man acts simply for his own good. Every man again interprets good as that which pleases him. Order can only be established when every man sees that he will get more good for himself by submitting to a common authority. When that is securely established, the individual will be repaid for sacrificing that right to everything which he could not enforce. But when that is done, the moral law is made supreme. For morality, according to Hobbes, is summed up in justice. That is, in observing the general contract according to which the distribution of good things is regulated, and men are obliged to keep their particular contracts. Equality before the law and equality of taxation are also implied, for inequality leads to discontent. But in other respects, every man may, and of course will, be guided by his own conceptions of good. As I have said before, Hobbes is not in favor of extending the sphere of legislation. Laws are like hedges, set not to stop travellers, but to keep them in their way. And therefore a law which is not needful, having not the true end of law, is not good. Unnecessary laws are not good laws, but traps for money, which, where the right of sovereign power is acknowledged, are superfluous, and where it is not acknowledged, insufficient to defend the people. This, it seems, is the essential meaning of Hobbes's identification of law and morality. They are, according to him, different aspects of the virtue which he calls justice. That means that a man acts morally so far as he pursues his own ends without harming his neighbour, and legally so far as he obeys the sovereign who enforces the security, without which it is not a man's interest to act morally. No doubt this is a totally inadequate view of morality. It is the legal or purely external conception which supposes that the moral, like the positive law, is satisfied by obeying certain sanctions which make bad conduct unprofitable. But it does not imply that the moral law is arbitrary or made at will by the sovereign. It is the law of self-preservation regarded from a purely egoistic point of view. 5. The spiritual power. Hobbes's theory may lead to some pretty problems in casuistry. How far should a man's duty to the state override the dictates of his conscience? May a soldier refuse to serve in a war that he thinks unjust? Or a Quaker refuse to fight at all? May a man refuse to pay taxes if he disapproves of the purpose for which they are raised? To admit such liberty unreservedly is to approve of anarchy, and upon that ground some people become anarchists. The problem, however, does not often present itself in practice. Most laws are sufficiently in conformity with the average morality of the people to excite no protest. But another question was far more pressing, and to Hobbes seemed to be the really critical question of the day. What is to be done when the subject's religious convictions clash with his obligations to the state? To that problem Hobbes gave an answer in his first treatise, which was expanded in the De Cive, and given at greater length and with many singular developments in the Leviathan. His essential position is simple enough. The sovereign has to keep the peace. Now men's actions proceed from their opinions, and therefore opinions must be governed in order to govern action, and governed in the interests of peace. He agrees that in speculation nothing ought to be regarded but the truth. True opinion, however, cannot be repugnant to peace. Yet the most sudden and rough bursting in of a new truth that can be does never break the peace, but only sometimes awake the war. That is, where error is already prevalent and people are ready to fight for it. It follows that the suppression of an opinion repugnant to peace must also be the suppression of error. He limits the suppression, however, to the public teaching, through books or otherwise, of objectionable opinions, for he also holds that a man's private beliefs cannot be determined by force. The sovereign is therefore bound to forbid the open propagation of opinions by which his authority is subverted. The diseases which bring about the dissolution of commonwealths are seditious opinions. Besides the opinion that every private man is to judge of good and evil, there is the opinion that a man may claim supernatural inspiration. A pernicious doctrine, which in this part of the world has been turned to account by the unlearned divines, sufficiently prevalent in the fanatical sects of the Commonwealth. But a still more vital power is represented by the claims of the papacy. This, in fact, means the cardinal error of a divided sovereignty. It is a setting up of supremacy against sovereignty, canons against laws, and a ghostly authority against the civil. Now, seeing it is manifest that the civil power and the power of the Commonwealth is the same thing, and that supremacy and the power of making canons implieth a commonwealth, it followeth that where one is sovereign, another supreme, where one can make laws and another make canons, there must needs be two commonwealths of one and the same subjects, which is a kingdom divided against itself and cannot stand. The ghostly power challengeth the right to declare what is sin, and therefore the right to declare what is law, for sin is nothing but the transgression of the law. As the civil power also declares what is law, it follows either that every subject must obey two masters, or that one of the two powers must be subordinate to the other. The civil authority has the advantage of being more visible, but the spiritual, though it deals in unintelligible doctrines, yet, because of the fear of darkness and ghosts, is greater than other fears, cannot want a party sufficient to trouble and sometimes to destroy a commonwealth. The spiritual power indeed has an advantage, for every man, as he says in the De Cive, if he be in his wits, will in all things yield that man an absolute obedience, by virtue of whose sentence he believes himself to be either saved or damned. Church or state, that is, must be supreme, or there will be a fatal disease which he quaintly compares to the epilepsy, a wind in the head, which makes men fall into fire or water. When the spiritual power moves the subject by the terror of punishment and hope of reward of this supernatural kind, and by strange and hard words suffocates their understanding, it must needs thereby distract the people, and either overwhelm the commonwealth by oppression, or cast it into the fire of a civil war. Which then is to be supreme? A church, like a state, must be an organized body, and have a sovereign before it can be said to will or command. He defines it, therefore, as a company of men professing Christian religion, united in the person of one sovereign, at whose command they ought to assemble, and without whose authority they ought not to assemble. Now, in all commonwealths, an assembly, in order to be lawful, must have the warrant of the civil sovereign. There is no power on earth to which all commonwealths are subject, and the Christians in each state are subject to its sovereign, and cannot be subject to any other power. Therefore a church is the same thing with the civil commonwealth, which is called a civil state, for that the subjects of it are men, and a church, for that the subjects thereof are Christians. Temporal and spiritual are two words brought into the world to make men see double and mistake their lawful sovereign. Unless there is one governor, there will be civil war between church and state, between the sword of justice and the shield of faith. And which is more, in every Christian man's own breast, between the Christian and the man. The church, in short, as a law-making or governing body, must be fused with the state. Otherwise we have the fatal splitting of sovereignty. An antagonist might have replied that the unity might be equally secured by subordinating the state to the church. An absolute theocracy, such as corresponded to the extremist claims of the papacy, would have satisfied the condition as fully as the secular sovereignty. To this Hobbes replies upon the historical ground. He denies that the Church of Rome, or indeed that the spiritual power from the beginning of the world, can make out any title to the sovereign power. Half of the Leviathan, namely the third part of a Christian commonwealth, and the fourth of the kingdom of darkness, is devoted to this argument. It is a most singular performance. Hobbes has to argue from the Bible, and quotes texts as confidently as any contemporary divine. He protests, indeed, with an air of perfect candour, that he has only taken the plainest sense, and that which is agreeable to the harmony and scope of the whole Bible. But his exegesis brings out results which nobody before or since has ever deduced from the same authority. We may wonder whether he is sincere or laughing in his sleeve, whether perhaps he means simply an argument ad hominem, or a tacit suggestion that any conclusions you please can be extorted from the documents whose authority he is bound to admit. Our confidence is not increased by his apology for his paradoxes. He admits that one doctrine, which he proves, will appear to most men a novelty. I do but propound it, he says, maintaining nothing in this or any other paradox of religion, but attending the end of that dispute of the sword concerning the authority, not yet amongst my countrymen decided, by which all sorts of doctrine are to be approved or rejected. Anyhow, the results are too grotesque to be given at length, or to be quite passed over. End of section 22. Section 23 of Hobbes by Leslie Stephen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, The State, Part 6. His contention is essentially that there never was a divinely instituted spiritual authority independent of the civil authority. The civil and ecclesiastical powers, for example, were united in Abraham, afterwards in Moses, and then in the high priests. Whoever had the sovereignty of the commonwealth among the Jews, the same had also the supreme authority in the matter of God's external worship, though the Jews got into many calamities from not properly understanding the rights of their rulers. The old dispensation, it might be supposed, was superseded by the Christian Church, and its rulers would represent Christ on earth. But the kingdom of Christ was not of this world. That, according to Hobbes, means that it will not be established until a new world begins upon the general resurrection. Then Christ will become a king in the literal sense. The good will come to life in their old bodies, for there is no such thing as a separate soul, and live eternally. They will not marry or be given in marriage, for otherwise the earth would obviously not be big enough to hold the resulting population. There will be no death vacancies. The wicked will also come to life in order to receive condign punishment. They will suffer the second death, which cannot, as he thinks, mean eternal life and torture, but simple extinction. As they will die, they may propagate, and therefore hell may be eternal in the sense that there will always be a supply of the wicked to be punished, though every individual will come to an end. This amazing theory is meant to show that since Christ's kingdom is not to become a reality until the resurrection, the Church is for the time being not a kingdom at all, but a mere voluntary association. The apostles and their successors could only persuade, not command, and had no coercive powers. Excommunication could only mean amicable separation, not the infliction of a penalty. The Church did not acquire legal authority until it was invested with power by the emperor. These queer speculations are connected with a more interesting set of arguments. Hobbes wishes to meet the claims of the Church to supernatural authority. He cannot deny, explicitly at any rate, that Moses and the prophets were divinely inspired. What he can do is to argue that their inspiration does not transmit supernatural authority to their descendants. Moses himself knew that he was speaking to Jehovah, but in what way Jehovah spoke to him is not intelligible. The Jews could only know that Moses told them that he was so speaking, and that makes a vital difference. When a prophet says that God has spoken to him in a dream, that is only to say he dreamed that God spoke to him, which is not of force to win belief from any man that knows that dreams are, for the most part, natural. To say that a man speaks by supernatural inspiration is to say he finds an ardent desire to speak in some strong opinion of himself, for which he can allege no natural and sufficient reason. So that though God Almighty can speak to a man by dreams, visions, voice, and inspiration, yet he obliges no man to believe he hath so done to him that pretends it, who, being a man, may err, and which is more, may lie. As miracles have ceased, we can now only appeal to the Holy Scriptures. What, then, is the authority of the Holy Scriptures? Hobbes goes through many of the passages which have been mentioned by later critics to show that the books ascribed to Moses and others were written after the time of the supposed authors. The Psalter must have been put into its present form after the captivity, as some of the Psalms refer to it. The authority of the Old Testament in general can only be traced to the time of Esdras, who discovered the books when they were lost. And the canon of the New Testament cannot be proved to have been authoritative before the Council of Laodicea in the year 364 A.D. Hobbes indeed believes that the New Testament books are genuine, for a characteristic reason. The doctors of the Church had claimed supreme power by the time of the Council, and thought pious frauds commendable. If they had altered the books, they would surely have made them more favourable to their power over Christian princes than they are. Why then do we believe the Scriptures to be the Word of God? Everybody, he says, admits the fact of inspiration, but no one can know it except those to whom God himself hath revealed it supernaturally. Men believe, though they do not know, for reasons so various that no general account of them can be given. But the question truly stated is, by what authority they, the Scriptures, are made law? The answer is obvious. They must be imposed by a sovereign authority, and if so, either by sovereigns, each absolute in his own territory, or by the Vicar of Christ, as sovereign of the universal Church, who must then have the power of judging, deposing, or putting to death the subordinate sovereigns. Meanwhile, every man is bound to make use of his natural reason to test the claims of a prophet. It is clear that a great many prophets are not to be trusted. When Ahab consulted 400 prophets, all but one were impostors, and a little before the time of the captivity, the prophets were generally liars. See Jeremiah 14:14. We must judge them, then, by their conformity to the established authority. When Christians do not take their own sovereign for God's prophet, they must take their own dreams, or obey some strange prince, or be bewitched into rebellion and the chaos of violence and civil war by some fellow subject. Hobbes proceeds to treat of miracles. We take an event to be miraculous when we do not perceive its cause. The first rainbow was a miracle, because the first, and consequently strange. A rainbow is not a miracle now, because it is no longer strange, even to those who do not know the cause. That may be a miracle to one man, which is not so to another. Before astronomy became a science, a man who predicted an eclipse would pass for a prophet. Juggling, ventriloquism, and thaumaturgy are common, and there is nothing, how impossible soever to be done, that is impossible to be believed. When we hear of a miracle, we must therefore consult the lawful head of the Church how far we are to give credit to the story. A private man has always the liberty, because thought is free, to believe or not believe in his heart those acts that have been given out for miracles, and he should consider who is likely to profit by them. But when it comes to the confession of that faith, the private reason must submit to the public, that is to say, to God's lieutenant. Hobbes was thus suggesting doubts to the evidences of the established creeds, doubts which were to bear fruit in a later generation. Spinoza, in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, treated the questions on wider grounds, and went a bar beyond what Hobbes has dared to say. No active controversy, however, arose till a later period. Hobbes's argument, we may notice, has a resemblance to that which Hume made famous. Both of them argue, not that miracles are impossible, but that the proof of a miracle is always insufficient. Hobbes has to assert that the events recorded in the Scriptures really happened, but endeavours to show that there is no proof that they happened. We must believe on authority, and moreover on the authority of the Church. Only by authority we do not mean the intellectual authority of competent inquirers, but the legal authority of the sovereign. Rather, we may believe what we like, but we may only profess the belief which the law allows us to profess. We have still to see why he rejects the alternative of the supremacy of the Church. The existing commonwealths are independent of each other, and therefore not subject in fact to any central authority. But it may still be urged that they ought to be subject to this. To this he replies partly by the familiar Protestant arguments from texts, and maintains that Bellarmine's interpretations of "feed my sheep" and so forth are erroneous. But the main answer is given in the last book, upon the kingdom of darkness. There he takes up the position which was already assumed in his account of the natural history of religion. The gods of the heathens are, as we have seen, mere phantasms, dreams mistaken for reality, and so forth. The Church of Rome adopted the same methods. By misinterpreting Scripture, the priests made people believe in devils and exorcism, in purgatory and the efficiency of sacraments, and other doctrines calculated to increase their power and give them authority over the secular rulers. They adopted many ceremonies and superstitions from the Gentiles, and they introduced the vain and erroneous philosophy of Aristotle to perplex men's minds. The argument ends by a quaint comparison between the papacy and the kingdom of fairies. The whole hierarchy has been built up like the old wives' fables in England concerning ghosts and spirits, and the feats they play in the night. It is needless to go into the details, but I may quote the striking phrase which sums up his theory. If a man consider the original of this great ecclesiastical dominion, he will easily perceive that the papacy is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof. The Roman Church, says a great living authority, in this way privily pushed itself into the place of the Roman world empire, of which it is the historical continuation. A comparison of the phrases may illustrate Hobbes's vigorous grasp of thought as well as command of words. His ascription of sovereignty in religious matters to the civil authority was startling enough, and led him into some difficulties. What, for example, are we to say of the Christian martyrs? They were clearly rebels, and yet have been generally praised for their conduct. Hobbes has to distinguish. To be a true martyr, a man must have received a calling to preach. He must, moreover, have seen the facts to which he testifies. If he testifies to the resurrection, he must have conversed with Christ before his death and seen him after he was risen. Otherwise, he can only be a martyr, that is, a witness, to other men's testimony. Moreover, there is only one article for which a man ought to die, namely, that Jesus is the Christ. We are not to die for every private tenet of our own, or for tenets which suit the clergy. Naaman set a very convenient precedent, and if, like him, we obey our sovereign in using words which do not express our thoughts, the action is not ours, but our sovereign's. To resist an infidel sovereign is to sin against the laws of God, for such are the laws of nature, and the counsel of the apostles, i.e., to obey princes. If we do not take Naaman's view, we must expect our reward in heaven. But he asks, what infidel king is so unreasonable as, knowing he has a subject that waiteth for the second coming of Christ after the present world shall be burnt, and intendeth then to obey him, which is the intent of believing that Jesus is the Christ, and in the meantime thinketh himself bound to obey the laws of that infidel king, which all Christians are obliged in conscience to do, to put to death or persecute such a subject? Certainly, if all that is meant by belief in Christ is an intention of obeying him as a king after the general resurrection, the infidel king would be very unreasonable. They sometimes are. Hobbes sums up his belief in one phrase. Religion, he says, in dedicating his 7 Problems to Charles II, is not philosophy, but law. We have already seen what is the view which he takes in his Natural History of Religion. Religion is the fear of power invisible. That is the essential meaning of the instinct, and legislators have taken advantage of it to strengthen their own authority and to keep the peace. Whether the objects of worship be real or phantasms, religion is useful, just so far as it promotes that end. We know nothing of God except his power, and it is upon his power that his authority is founded. All the other attributes ascribed to him are not to declare what he is, but how much we honor him. The end of worship among men is power. The worship of God is directed by those rules of honor that reason dictateth to be done by the weak to the more potent men in hope of benefit, or for fear of damage, or thankfulness for good received. Prayer and thanks are simply an acknowledgment of God's power. Rational worship argues a fear of him, and fear is a confession of his power. I will not ask whether Hobbes's theological conceptions would really justify even this account of religion. It comes apparently to this, that religion is a system of beliefs and observances imposed by the sovereign in order to give force to the law of nature, that is, the law of self-preservation, and the obligations of the social contract. Modern thinkers have given a good many definitions of religion, but this, I fancy, is not among them. Hobbes's purpose is clear enough. The Church, as he holds, is an organized body which has taken advantage of phantasms and dreams to claim supernatural powers, and to forge a system of spiritual weapons capable of encountering the secular weapons of the sovereign. Then it has elaborated the sham philosophy of the schoolman, the empusa, which strangles thought by words, and enables it to bewilder men by mysterious dogmas which are really nonsense. In attacking the Church, therefore, he is defending the cause of enlightenment against a systematic obscurantism. He traces the growth of the spiritual power through 3 stages. First, the claim of priests to make belief obligatory instead of free. Secondly, the concentration of this power in the hands of bishops. And thirdly, absorption of the episcopal in the papal power. Queen Elizabeth got rid of the Pope, the Presbyterians of the bishops, and the Presbyterians have now lost their power, so that we are reduced to the independency of the primitive Christians, every man believing what he pleases. This, he says, is perhaps the best. First, because there ought to be no power over the consciences of men, but of the word itself, working faith in every man. And secondly, because it is unreasonable to ask a man to accept the reasons of others, which is little better than to venture his salvation at cross and pile. Priests ought to know that power is preserved by the same virtues by which it is acquired, that is to say, by wisdom, humility, clearness of doctrine, and sincerity of conversation, and not by suppression of the natural sciences and the morality of natural reason, nor by obscure language, nor by arrogating to themselves more knowledge than they make appear, nor by pious frauds, nor by other faults which tend to scandal. Hobbes would thus seem to be in favor of complete religious toleration and absolute indifference of the state in religious matters. How is this reconcilable with the theory that religion is law? The explanation is not far to seek. The endless religious controversies had been made an argument on one side for the necessity of a central spiritual authority, and on the other for a limitation of the essentials of religious belief to the points upon which all men were agreed. Hobbes, having, in words at least, to accept the Christian doctrines, declares that the only article of faith which the Scripture maketh simply necessary to salvation is this, that Jesus is the Christ. An article which, as we have seen, he manipulates strangely enough. Other dogmas need not trouble us, for it is with the mysteries of our religion as with wholesome pills for the sick, which swallowed whole have the virtue to cure, but chewed, are for the most part cast up again without effect. Now, when the state orders us to swallow, it will allow us to take our pills whole. The state, as he says, can only take notice of our words. It is one of the vital errors of the false teachers to extend the power of the law to the very thoughts and consciences of men. That, he intimates, means the Inquisition, which he detests as heartily as any man. The only interest of the state is in peace. The secular sovereign will not want to rouse theological quarrels or to burn his subjects to enforce dogmas. Persecution is the natural consequence when a great corporation has been built up upon the ground of a dogmatic system, and when all its interests depend upon enforcing orthodoxy. The destruction of such a power is Hobbes's real aim. If we subordinate the Church to the state, the secular sovereign will be no longer the tool of the priest, and even if he prescribes the verbal acceptance of certain dogmas, he will take care that they do no harm. His aim will be to suppress controversy, not to hinder speculation. The doctrine of toleration was developing, though slowly enough, and Hobbes saw one difficulty clearly. If by religion we mean simply the creed of the individual, the case for toleration is obvious and overpowering. It must be wrong, that is, to punish a man for accepting what he believes to be true. But a practical difficulty remains when religion is regarded as the creed of an organized body, which has therefore a system of laws. What is to be done when such laws come into conflict with the laws of the state? The difficulty need not occur if, as a matter of fact, the Church and state do not represent conflicting theories, or if there be an agreement as to a demarcation of their spheres of action. But as religious motives affect men's conduct as a whole, the Church can hardly be indifferent to every part of the action of the state. When differences occur, as for example when the state undertakes the charge of education, there is even in our own day a great difficulty in applying the principle of toleration, however much it may be accepted in general terms. In Hobbes's time, such difficulties were of course much greater. The Puritan proposed to alter the constitution of the Church, but not to diminish its authority, or to divorce it from the state. As sects multiplied, the principle of toleration became more widely accepted, for it is plain that when you are in a minority of one, your only logical plea for liberty must imply universal toleration. Meanwhile, Hobbes, disgusted by the struggles of rival sects and the claims of the Catholic Church to interfere with political matters in the interest of the hated dogmatic system, took a short cut to a solution. Instead of trying to effect a reconciliation, he would simply put one power under the feet of the other, and the dominant power should be that which is least given to bigotry. In some respects, Hobbes's solution was that which actually succeeded. The claim of the Pope to depose kings was of little practical importance, and Hobbes, like his countrymen, seems to have been unduly nervous. Giant Pope, though far from being so decrepit as Bunyan thought, was ceasing to have much authority over the political world. The Church of England was following the course which Hobbes desired. He complains that the bishops made certain claims to independent authority, but remarks that at any rate they had practically submitted to the king. That tendency developed, and Hobbes would have been thoroughly content with the 18th century, when the Church ceased to make any claim to corporate power, and the clergy became useful dependents on the possessors of patronage. End of section 23. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, 2024. End of Hobbes by Leslie Stephen.